This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end.
So we continuing with what was loosely entitled as Razor's Edge. And it is emphatically addressed to those who are willing to delve into the perspective of what all of us undoubtedly now share in terms of this, what is happening and has been brought about by the spread of this virus, and how this in no time kind of developed into international crisis, a calamity in its own right, in its own way, with many, many repercussions as the waves went in every direction. So we felt the need to address the, if you will, those who are willing at least, or open at least, to consider viewing all this from a perspective where a blame cannot be placed on anyone, simply because, in the words of great 20th century sage Ramana Maharshi, there is no one, there is no other. And of course, it's not to hit anyone with this radicalism as a baseball bat treatment, which disregards the existence of polarities, existence of multiplicities, and various degrees and levels of consciousness at which we operate on a daily basis. However, if we don't address this, if we don't speak about this, if we don't bring this into the focal point of our attention, then we bypass a very interesting and visceral opportunity for certain, if you will, unprecedented breakthroughs that could happen and do happen precisely during those moments in time when things no longer go as we have planned them, when things no longer go as we have expected them to go. And here we speak now in a global way. It's no longer pertinent to, I wanted to play that soccer game and I broke my foot, so it's an individual calamity, and I'm no longer performing at a very important game. I wanted to get married, but my bride ran away. So, again, my calamity here somehow is only mine to lament, maybe a couple of friends, family members, but it's certainly not an international event. Where is the degree of this proportion? It is an international event, a global event. So many plans have been postponed, cancelled, and with no mercy to, but I wanted that, I would, So this is why we use this as an opportunity to examine this and delve into this and see what can open up in our own field. So in other words, I have to say that this is addressed to the spiritually minded, spiritually oriented folks, and for some people it may just fly over their head, and for some people this may sound completely impractical, not timely, and a waste of time, in fact. But that being said, not even every spiritually minded folk will necessarily share these perspectives. So I will speak to them nevertheless and leave it to all of you to ponder on, to contemplate on, and to see how it sits and resonates with each and every one of you. So what we have here is nothing short of a situation, if you will, when we reach out for prophecies. And in one of our last gatherings online, we spoke about even, I gave an example how this, what is called this current pandemic, has been prophesied. So I wanted to open up today from this place of fulfillment of prophecies. And fulfillment of prophecies here will require for all of us to delve also into what are the prophecies. What's the difference between guessing, second guessing, or even being absolutely sure what is to happen versus something which makes it into a true prophecy. And of course, it's very tempting to add to that, if we were to write an essay or papers, or, we would say fulfillment of prophecies and false prophets, because that would seem very, very fitting, because that's what we're also experiencing these days, is the rise of the so-called false prophets. They may have existed throughout all this more recent and not so more recent history. They may have existed more at the time when we were on the pericarp, when something is about to happen. So there are these various perspectives being entertained, and many people are coming forth with prophesying on how it's going to take, what is to happen. So I want to build this a little bit with an example of an extraordinary, illustrious figure in the field of psychology, someone I often mention in my discourses, retreats, gatherings, and even in private circles. The name of Carl Jung doesn't need introduction to a modern folk. Most people know who Carl Jung was. Carl Jung is considered to be, rightfully considered to be, a spiritual father of psychology. If Sigmund Freud is spoken of and recognized universally as the father of psychology, because he kind of came up with all this, what took the world by storm. Carl Jung disagreed with his mentor, because they were in that relationship, and pushed forward his own understandings and his own insights, and he came up with a lot of amazing ideas. And as some of you may know, he was deeply influenced by Indian thought, by Indian philosophy per se, and by Tantra in particular. I often speak about his classical Kundalini seminars, which he held in 1932 in Zurich. And I would like to, one day, maybe soon, to dedicate a whole entire program to it, because it's a fascinating subject. And of course, Jung could be credited with bringing this knowledge for the very first time, perhaps, to the academia and to the intellectuals of his world, at least. Because these seminars are, if you will, very, very important. At the time when they happened, they cast out a completely new way. There is no way for existence of transpersonal psychology without Carl Jung and his contribution to this. So Carl Jung, as some of you who may be more familiar, because this is more specific to the work of that great man, was also known for coming up with his own idea of, if you will, of the end of the world. Carl Jung had his own prophecies that he laid upon us quite heavily, and there were 3 of them, not just one prophecy, but 3 prophetic, if you will, utterings that he wove into his teachings, wove into his work. All 3 of them were based on dreams that he had at some point in his life. 2 of these dreams happened right at the beginning, just before those 2 horrendous, horrible wars of the past century took place. The First World War and the Second World War the World War II. And the last prophetic dream he had shortly before he breathed his last. So this, if you will, legacy of Carl Jung, laying this prophecy that the world is about to end, and that we, in fact, living at the time when the world is already ended, according to Carl Jung. Another name I have mentioned in one of my previous broadcasts here is that of a brilliant writer, philosopher of our time. I don't know if he will be happy with these credits or not, but Peter Kingsley is known as a brilliant writer, often misunderstood than not in his own circles. And in his latest book, Catafalque, Carl Jung and the End of the World as a subtitle, argues that this is exactly what this whole thing is about when it comes to the Carl Jung's teaching. When it comes to the output, the entire output of Carl Jung's teaching, the aforementioned author, Peter Kingsley, argued in this work that the entire Jungian society, there's even the term Jungians, somehow preferred not to hear, not to take this to the heart. And what Peter Kingsley said to unravel in his latest work is that the most influential, let's say, or one of the most influential figures in Western European culture of that time, who has influenced the whole thought, at least when it comes to the field of psychology, which is extremely important today, extremely important. As I often say, psychology came at the time when the custodians of religions could no longer serve the purpose assigned to them. And the vacuum has been created, tremendous vacuum, where this job that was done by a priest, very often in the form of a confession, is being now taken by or delegated to the field of psychology. So the psychologists today, the so-called shrinks, using that New York slang, are the priests of our time. And Carl Jung, that would make him the highest priest of them all. And this perspective essentially speaks to the utter misunderstanding of the entire pondering and reevaluating of the influence that this great man had, at the expense of dismissing, if not castrating, the main message of his teaching, or the main emphasis that he somehow wanted to deliver, especially in his latest work, as the Red Book is known for. This, of course, is not about Carl Jung, so don't just roll your eyes up and don't just get disappointed. What I would like to direct our attention now, in view of all that is being said, is to that theme and that topic of the prophecy. And somehow here where the personal will meet transpersonal. So in other words, just as we gave that perspective on what potentially was the main message of Carl Jung, that is, that we live right now when the world is already ended. Because that's what Peter Kingsley argued in his work in turn, with that emphatic title, or rather unmistakable title, unforgiving title, Catafalque. If some of you are not native speakers, reach out. Catafalque is a term for that, what carries the corpses. So the emphasis here is that we live at the end of the current culture. And that's what Jung meant. The world has ended. The whole value of the world that has been infested prior to that time has ended as we know it. And don't forget, Jung came up with this way before all this, if you will, what we now know as another potential frontier, which will divide human race sooner or later in terms of whether we continuously embrace the so-called merging between biological human organism and biological human life per se with artificial intelligence. Because this is not the stuff of 19th century Victorian novels and fairy tales. It is the stuff of today's cutting-edge science and investigations into this domain, if you will, where the fundings are not in shortage. So, let's just put a full stop there. It's just to take a pause, which will allow us to take a sip. Has the world ended or not? Tea in this cup has certainly ended. Let's look into the whole thing about the end of the world. And I want all of you to be very attentive, because we speak about, or rather now embark on to the territory which is no longer as clearly defined or as clearly definable as to say, you know, this, that. It's very, very subtle. So this idea of the end of the world, and by the way, just before we proceed, I just want to maybe add or throw into, it is also very well known, and today there's this revival, if you will, there has been revival even in the social media, of the reevaluation of the whole term of the apocalypse. There was a brilliant documentary narrated by no one but Morgan Freeman, right? Who, as we know, has played not just many different men, he even played God. And not on one occasion, but at least on a couple occasions. Whether he just was born with such physique that he was fit to play that character, it's beside the point. He's a great actor. But Morgan Freeman narrated that documentary on the apocalypse, of what this term represents, and as it turned out in the second or the third episode, that the term itself comes from the ancient Greek, right? Revelation. Going beyond something which is obvious. It's like peeling the layers. So the apocalypse then could be interpreted in different ways. So when we speak about the cult movie by Francis Ford Coppola, Apocalypse Now, which is considered to be one of the greatest anti-war movies of all time, with Marlon Brando at his prime, right, as that U.S. Army officer gone completely rogue and just hiding in the jungles of Cambodia. The whole meaning of that movie may be changed if we know that the term apocalypse is not the end of the world. In a way, it's revelation of how things are as opposed to how we have considered things to be. And I quite welcome the idea that the great director who directed this movie and came up with this idea might have known very well the multidimensional meaning of that term. So in other words, the idea of the end of the world, the idea of the apocalypse, which you can find even through the history of art, through the works of art, and all this, of course, neatly and tightly associated mostly with the Christendom, although we can find allusions also in Islamic culture and in Islamic metaphysics, that the end of the world is equally presented in that religion as well, maybe with less emphasis than it is known in Christianity as that part of the Old Testament known as the Apocalypse. So, now we can take a breath, speaking to myself, and I'd like to make a pause here. And as I said, this is where personal meets transpersonal. And I want to go back to a little bit to talk about myself a little bit, although this is not really desirable, as it's not the kind of book signing event where one talks about one's biography, so people buy books. After all, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a beloved teacher, said that it's not our job to talk about ourselves, our job is to bring the message. Message is important, not the messenger. But he said that's in relation to monks. And since I don't live life of a monk by large, I'm pretty far from it, maybe the very opposite end of that, what monk stands for, I will allow myself a little bit, why would I be even qualified to speak about prophecies and stuff, So this maybe will be a little bit a surprise for some of you to hear this, of what I'm about to say, with regard to what was unpacked in part 1, where I was speaking to the very, very different, if you will, we took a very different take. I make it brief, but I think it might bring some additional angle, and of course all of you feel free to throw it back at me whenever you want to, whenever you feel fitting. Like whenever someone comes out into the field, whenever someone comes up with something and comes into the territory where the peers are present, where there will definitely be this rapport, a certain degree of evaluation where you are, because it's not that we all went to the same university, right? All spiritual teachers out there didn't go to the same university, where we kind of jostled around and then know each other and we can write each other endorsements. No, very often we come from so different walks of life that brings us into this position that sometimes one wonders, like, what, going on behind the scenes. So certainly when my turn was to come out into the open, into this field, and to step into these shoes fully, consciously, in a public arena, I was, or could have been considered very rightly, to be that new kid on the block. The only thing is that I was pretty much in my 40s already, years after even the major impact of transformation of consciousness took place. And it also coincided with a full integration, including starting a new family and having children coming one after the other, and completely embracing that role of the household, the way of life. It is then when I consciously went out into the open to teach. But the decision was need to be made. How do I do that? And this is, of course, do you underplay? Do you kind of like play it cool? There are many different ways of how a new kid on the block can conduct herself or himself to be taken. You see? How one wants to be taken versus with a pinch of salt. And since I was coming largely from that British, if you will, English background, in the sense that I've lived in London since my mid-20s, I didn't go through the education there, but I soaked in enough of that, if you will, Englishness through the associations, friends, relationships, which is very opposite, let's say, to what's happening in California. In California, if you can do something, then you will make everyone know that you can do that. And you will say this 5 times in one sentence. So of course, me coming to teach in California, because that's exactly where I first appeared, despite the fact that I was already teaching and had my first students, but that's totally different story. This is not known to the majority. I had to downplay myself, and I was downplayed because I was downplaying myself with that British attitude of, let's be subtle. Let's be kind of like, let's assume others will get it. And yet, behind the scenes, some of the people who, let's say, inadvertently took part in helping me to establish myself in this role know that it was very different when I would communicate in private with them. It was very different in terms of how I presented myself. For example, when I wrote to this man who held a very successful show, I said, "Who are your top dogs? Name them to me." And he said, "Well, it's so and so." They're like, "Who? Ah, four," like that. I said, "They're half-baked. Both half-baked, not unity consciousness." And since we had the same background, for him understanding what unity consciousness, he was, "Really? What? And who are you? Oh, okay, let's talk." And we talked. So it was recorded. It was out there, available. It was aired for quite a few years. Now you can only find, unfortunately, the transcribes of these interviews, but beside the point is I wasn't pussyfooting in the introducing myself of where I was coming from. In private, I was very direct, very honest, sincere, transparent about the state of affairs of what I went through, what degree of self-realization, and so forth. And of course, it quickly made me, won me a lot of friends and less than friends. Because that's the way it works in the horizontal plane of reality. Whenever you say something, if you hold certain perspectives, then you will be judged in accordance. What am I hitting at here is that all I want to say is that there was, in fact, a prophetic encounters that I held way before what could be spoken of in terms of the transformation of consciousness that I spoke at various talks and interviews. This was when I was still in my early 20s, way before I left then Soviet Union. In fact, I was a student at St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts. And it was a very interesting time because there were all signs of the collapse of the Soviet Union is imminent. And I was on the verge of making that decision whether to continue studying in this most prestigious art institution in Russia ever, that St. Petersburg's Academy of Fine Arts was known for, or simply quit my studies and leave. In other words, abandon this whole thing, and begin my career of an artist and just, throw myself into the unknown. And I had this dream very quickly. It was essentially everything you can speak of in terms of the end of the world, because there were volcanoes, earthquakes, whole cities, whole countries collapsed, everything, like earth would just open. I mean, you name it. The whole thing was just completely like in one of those Hollywood movies about 2012. And then the powerful rain. And the rain, more of a heaven fall down on earth. It was just this complete collapse of heaven onto earth in the form of thunder, storms and rains. So a lot of water came. And as this progressed, I found myself being somewhere tumbled down under the water. So holding that breath, bit of the last breath that I had left with in my chest, I open my eyes and suddenly see there's like flickering of the light somewhere up there. And I begin to swim there because if I don't hurry, I will take the risk to drown there and then. So I come to the surface, gasp for air, and make myself adjust to look around. Nothing is recognizable. It's just the streams of water, and in fact, I'm kind of seeing the tops of the trees are only visible, and as the water flows everywhere. Some bits of land may be protruding somewhere. Very biblical. And at this moment, as I was looking where to moved towards, this suddenly tiger appeared out of nowhere. And this tiger leaped forth above my head, so I had to duck down, and I beheld that whole belly of the tiger as it leaped over me and landed into the top of the tree, only to realize it's not going to hold him, and he was forced to swim. And beholding this whole thing was astonishing experience, because I knew it's the end of the world, and I was terrified to the very, very roots of my hairs. And yet, it was also spectacularly beautiful, virginally beautiful, primordially beautiful to behold this wild creature in such proximity as it leaped over my head. And then, with that experience of beauty, I began to swim in parallel with the tiger, just as this tiger was making a living, or trying to survive, if you will, not making a living, trying to remain afloat, and I was just swimming in parallel, and gradually, slowly, the dream has receded and I woke up. Of course, I never told about this dream to anyone for a number of years, but I wrote it down meticulously, still in Russian language back then, in my diaries. And it had that quality of the prophetic dream, that the world has ended. I don't even know if there are any survivors. I don't know, whether there's anyone out there. But there was this, if you will, complete sense of renewal, complete and utter sense of spring, if you will. The air was crystal clear, sparkling clear. I could just feel it. And I know, I don't even know where I'm going to put my foot, on what part of land. But swimming and seeing that tiger at a distance, and there is this mutual respect as well as the sense of danger, and swimming along. Of course, sharing this, if any of you are in the field of psychology, you will begin to already analyze the meaning of the dream. After all, Carl Jung himself came up with the whole system of dream interpretation. And it's a very important part. Some spiritual teachers incorporate that into their teaching, into their counseling. So this could be interpreted. Every animal, let alone big animals, such tiger, belong to a totemic group of animals, and tiger stands for a specific quality. Okay? All this can be interpreted, scrutinized, broke down to the elements. So this personal meets transpersonal is where I invite you to look into, because it took me quite a few years when this dream popped up into my awareness again from a very different perspective, because I had the chance to reevaluate the meaning of the dream. Not that there were no longer any dreams that can be also telling and instructing and guiding, or throwing signs of warning and so forth. But that dream stood, if you will, as that point of departure, where in my own psyche, something ended with that world that I experienced in that dream, ended forever, exploded in the fire of the erupted volcanoes, and then shaken down to the ground with the earthquakes, with all the water pouring down to wash it all eventually, and only having to rise up for that bit of breath so as to find life again at the surface level of existence. What was unveiled to me in the profound states of when undergoing this in my mid-30s now, some over a decade after that particular dream that I just shared with all of you, I've realized that that was in itself, if you will, a direct reminder on that individual or level of consciousness that there is no end as we know it. So all these perspectives that I was exposed later on in my life on the possibility of the world potentially could end one way or the other, including the more recent ones where a lot of even spiritual folk have lost their peace and have lost their cool and have lost their sense of equanimity, and they're raising their voices. So in other words, when looking back, years after, when undergoing this transformation and undergoing the real process of awakening of consciousness, the nature of that dream was fully reevaluated. And indeed, it was prophetic in a sense that it gave that understanding that what we speak as the end of the world simply does not exist in a sense of what we apply when we speak and when we operate with these terms. And it was viscerally already experienced, if you will, by me in my early 20s. Because what also was interesting is that with that realization, a lot of fears, a lot of these unconscious fears, they were kind of, if you will, fell on the background. I'm not going to say that they were dissolved completely, but there's visceral fear of how it's going to pan out. How is it going to be? What's going to happen? Something in the psyche revealed to itself that there is no such thing as the end of the world, how we speak about it. So of course, equipped with this personal realization or at the level of individual consciousness, it was great to find the confirmations of that in the perspectives so beautifully and so emphatically expressed in the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism, where the whole perspective on the creation differs radically with many philosophical systems, even in comparison with those that were originated or born in the Indian subcontinent. Namely, that the perspective on creation, the perspective on this whole trajectory, you know, like that Hindu perspective, for example, that very well-known Hindu perspective, that Trinity, that there is this aspect that creates Brahma, that what sustains all this creation, Vishnu, and then the job of the Shiva is to reabsorb all this creation into himself. Or in other words, it's that perspective where this trajectory takes place. From the point of view of Kashmir Shaivism, there is no such thing as, if you will, trajectory of that creation. It's not taking place, even if we are to speak in terms of concentric view of time that the Hindus really developed, came up with. It's known as Manvantara, the concentric view of the reality of time. In other words, time is not understood in the Vedic thought, which underlies all Hindu belief systems. It's not viewed as a linear process, which gave a lot of hard time to Einstein, who namely refuted the existence of time, because time is not a constant. It's a relative phenomenon. Later on, he went as far as to say that there's no such thing as time at all. But in the Vedic perspective, it's simply a concentric, if you will, movement, exemplified by certain epochs known as yugas and so forth, with mathematical precision and mind-boggling or mind-bending degree of figures involved of how it all correlates to each other, as you know, what comprises, let's say, one day of Brahma, millions and millions of years on the planet Earth. And that then in turn adjusted, checked by the one day of Vishnu, which comprises the whole, if you will, epoch of reemergence of Brahma. And then it's like, why it's called mind-bending, because it has this incomprehensible vastness that the Manvantara theory of time speaks to. And yet in Kashmir Shaivism, the perspective of time, or the perspective of creation, is spoken in terms of reality is recreated at the infinitesimal level at each moment in time. In other words, there's no such thing as a point in time where reality came into being in whatever form we can speak of it, even if it came into being in the most fundamental way as lights of particles of lights, and then, you know, all that cooled off down to the level of what we call matter, or calcified down as the vibration slowed down. From the perspective of this philosophy, reality never came into existence and never cannot come, not that it can come out of existence. There is no moment in time when we call creation, so therefore Big Bang is refuted from the point of view of the Tantras of Kashmir Shaivism. This perspective we speak of, where Big Bang is, if you will, not even an applicable point of reference, because there's no such thing as beginning, which then has this unfoldment, and that unfoldment would have to follow a certain trajectory. And just like from somewhere in the back of my memory, at the times when certain, let's say, interests in astrophysics, you know, and what have you, remember the perspective where the universe is forever expanding, and that forever expansion of the universe will create that galaxies and all the heavenly bodies will drift away from each other, and we're going to be gobbled, like, you know, speaking of cosmic distancing, planets taking distance and galaxies taking distance from itself, and this is the end of it. And yet here, the perspective is that what we call life, what we call creation, what we call existence, are only categories applicable to this experience. But in reality, nothing came into being, therefore nothing can ever come out of being. That what we experience as this marble world of forms and phenomena is the very form of consciousness, of awareness itself. And it doesn't know beginning, middle part, or an end. So therefore, if you will, the true prophecy is never about how things will pan out. The true prophecy is never about what is going to happen. The true prophecy is not about in what manner something will happen. The true prophecy is always what is at all times, what is therefore right now. And if we look into the figures that were considered to be great prophets, it's not the emphasis of the teaching or the message was never on, in the year so and so there will be this, or doing this and that will bring you that, and then it will come to that, and at that, by that year, if you haven't done it, goodbye, the world has or about to end. But rather repositioning of what is has always been and will remain so, and that is in relation to the essence of who we are. Therefore, whenever we hear prophets, whenever we hear people who come into this arena, I call them loosely, like literally prophets, they don't have to wear the mantle of the prophet, they don't have to speak about it in these terms, but whoever tries to speak from the perspective of how it's going to be, how bad it's going to be, how gloomy it's going to be, or how amazing it's going to be, is missing the point. because the point is never about how it's going to be. The point is how it is right now, because how it is right now, how it has always been and will remain to be until this body will have to come to a point when it has to perish and something else then for you to experience. Whatever that is, it's a speculation. So I wanted to speak to that in this spoken part, which take us to that, what is the real secret beneath all these secrets? What is the real secret? What is the real deal here? What is the real thing one can truly lean on, place one's understanding? And if you will, not only the real secret, but one and the only thing to understand, because if that understanding really there, then a lot of confusion and a lot of misperception of one's role and one's place is then, if you will, fallen on a background. And that, of course, brings about the possibility of tremendous amount of energy being freed from what otherwise is known as mental dialogue, a constant shuffling of how things might be, how things might not be, and where am I with that, and from lowest of the low to highest of the high. All these perspectives. Where does it take me? Where does it leave me? What is my place? What is my role? I want to pursue spiritual thing, but I don't want the world to end. You know, if I'm doing my spiritual practice, I might be selfish, inconsiderate. You know, house is on fire. How can I meditate? I need to run, find a bucket. I need to start extinguishing the fire. You see, there is this constant battle going on. I'm recycling very well already, but that's not enough. What shall I do? I've signed 100 petitions, but they keep multiplying. There is this continuous dialogue, continuous struggle going on. What is it really going on? Where is peace in that? Will there come a time when suddenly house is not on fire, we saved it from fire, we sit down, dolphins are alive, we're no longer killing them, whales are not throwing themselves on the shores, planets are in their orbits, and we can just sit down and have some tea in peace. Therefore, we speak to this, what understanding really is required here. And as with a lot of things, it is so simple. It's almost feels as a betrayal of one's intelligence, because when one tries to contemplate on this, the whole gamut of one's education seems to be a waste. A whole acquiring of the knowledge seems to be a waste. A whole, if you will, highly held positions or perspectives, you know, in society, within oneself, in the family, it suddenly makes very little difference. So therefore, often these perspectives, no matter how simple, get somehow rejected. Somehow this perspective is being pushed away. And then if one is riding already a high horse, there is a great possibility that this perspective will be thwarted at every occasion. It will be ridiculed. It will be called bypassing. It will be called spiritual bypassing. It will be called irresponsible. It will be called this, it will be called that. And one will agree with that, because if one does not have proper understanding, one will be haunted by this, because that's how it works. So therefore, we speak to this. So the only real thing there is, has always been, is to bring your awareness to the level of being. Bringing your awareness to the level of being is what restores all harmony everywhere, in absolutely every corner of the universe, no matter how vast that universe is. It's a quantum understanding, and it's the understanding that most, if you will, spiritual traditions, most teachings of perennial wisdom that stood the test of time, that worth of their salt, always emphasized in all times. Bringing your consciousness, your awareness to the level of being, state of being. That's all that is required. What is that state of being? Of course, being, again, we speak about it and very often it's incomprehensible, means so many things to so many people. The simplest thing to relate to that term, it's the state of stillness. It's the state of pure silence. It's the state of one's Shivahood. It's the state which is the source of it all. If our awareness is brought to that level, there is absolutely nothing that is not covered in any of the planes of existence, be it intermediary, subtle levels, subtle planes of existence, where everything in a molten state of pure potentiality, where everything is in that state, it can take any form at any time, where the blueprint of reality yet to come is being formed, or down to the gross level of what is happening at the level we call life, what we call incarnated level of reality, where the food is being put on the table, where the roof is being erected above the house, above the head, so that one can live in safety and enjoy. All these levels are naturally sustained and covered from that level. Sustained, it's important to emphasize that. So all the end of the world scenario ends with that state of being. But if not touched upon, if not lived from that level, no amount of hustling and bustling, running around, being of help, or looking as if being of help, or raising all these issues, or raising this flag, or being very important in one's enterprise, or being somehow extremely considerate and extremely compassionate because the world is going to end and this is not on, because the animals are dying, species are dying, now the virus is upon us. This is fundamental misunderstanding of how everything sits together. Therefore, I speak from the level of consciousness where this is understood to be the primordial state of affairs. Dismiss it, but the knowledge is given. Dismiss it. Roll your eyes, laugh at it, until you'll find out within your own self that that's all there is. No changes ever came into the world, ever, from a place which essentially is a result of what is taking place at a deeper levels of reality. And there is no deeper level of reality than one's own awareness. Being is all there is. In the first part, we talked about how everything is already as it is, without being asked of us how it sits in our understanding. We spoke about the impossibility to even accept anything, because acceptance is still an ego trip of I am accepting it. Excuse me, it's already accepted without us being involved. This is the understanding that I illustrated with the words of Rumi and Kabir, with the words of Lalan of Kashmir. The great mystics who abide in the states of consciousness and spoke from that place where this understanding is the ultimate level of how reality can be measured. Nothing can measure reality. It's immeasurable. So this level is always spoken know thyself. Know thyself. The world has always been ending. Always have been ending. So this mentioning of Carl Jung earlier today is to say that he was naive in his assessments, that he somehow foresaw the end of the world. Naive in his assessments, in his understanding, no matter how brilliant and intellectual of his time he was. He was naive because it was not supplemented by the direct, visceral insights into the nature of ultimate reality. Reading books about Tantra, taking Tantric courses, studying Tantra, it's not equal to applying Tantra. And Tantra is a methodology. It's meant to be applied. If it's not applied, it's like having the most sophisticated equipment, right? And having no clue how to operate it and not even using it. Imagine the most sophisticated thing ever here, like, you know, like the tea can just brew itself in the cup without it being grown in China or Japan. Just looking at the cup, and cup is filled with this tea. I have this methodology, but I'm not applying it. So what's the use of it? So of course, I would have to then go online, order the tea, wait till it arrives, pay tax, finally get the right water, right? So it doesn't spoil the softness of the tea, you know, so it doesn't burn the tea. And there we have infinity in the cup. This is why I said it's subtle. I should maybe even speaking a little bit more in confusing terms, so that this mind, eager to understand, doesn't grab it. So I got it. Because there's nothing to forget, you see? There is nothing to get and nothing to forget. Just ponder on this. There's nothing that one can really, truly bring home, but one can, if you will, come up with all the difference in the world when this is truly understood. I don't know if you remember in history, constant battles for Jerusalem, right? Oh my God, how much blood was spilled to own Jerusalem because it was a symbol. It might be a negative example, but still, in the history of Western European, at least, civilization, in the history of this fight between the religions and states, a question was asked, so what's the actual meaning of this victory? What does Jerusalem worth? Nothing, the answer, and everything. Nothing, because it's really nothing that there in these walls, nothing, and yet everything. Why? Because it's a status symbol, the very symbol of the godly city. So this example here applied just to kind of throw that, if you will, colorful illustration of what this understanding is nothing and everything. It's like a watershed that separates ignorance from knowing. So this is what I want to speak in this part today, mostly.